In the sprawling, sleepless metropolis of Seoul, where the neon lights fight a constant, dazzling battle against the creeping darkness of the night, there stands a monument to human ambition that pierces the clouds. The Gold Group Tower is not merely a building, it is a fortress of glass and steel, a glittering needle that stitches the sky to the earth, casting a long, imposing shadow over the Han River. To the millions of ordinary people who walk in its shadow every day, craning their necks to see the summit that disappears into the smog, it represents the absolute pinnacle of South Korean economic power. It is a place where fortunes are made overnight, where destinies are rewritten with invisible ink, and where the fate of the national market is decided with the casual stroke of a fountain pen. But for those who exist within its hermetically sealed walls, the tower is something far more sinister. It is a battlefield disguised as a sanctuary of commerce. The air inside is always conditioned to a precise, frigid temperature, scientifically calculated to keep the employees alert, anxious, and perpetually on the edge of their seats. It is a world of sharp Italian suits that cost more than a car, even sharper tongues that can destroy a career in a sentence, and eyes that are constantly scanning the room for a flicker of weakness. The silence here is not peaceful, it is heavy, weighted down by the unspoken fears of thousands who dread the sound of their own footsteps echoing too loudly on the polished granite floors. At the very bottom of this gleaming, unforgiving hierarchy, entirely invisible to the eyes of the powerful men and women who stride through the lobby with purpose, lives Mrs. Han. She is 52 years old, though the deep, sorrowful lines etched around her eyes and the weary, permanent curve of her spine suggest a life lived twice as long. Her hands are rough like sandpaper, the skin cracked and dry from decades of exposure to harsh industrial chemicals, smelling permanently of bleach and synthetic lemon cleaner. These hands tell the story of a woman who has carried the weight of the world without a single complaint, a woman who has sacrificed every ounce of her youth for survival. Mrs. Han is a ghost in the machine. She moves through the endless corridors pushing her gray plastic utility cart, the wheels squeaking in a rhythmic cadence that matches her heartbeat. She scrubs black scuff marks from the pristine marble floors until her knees ache and throb. She wipes greasy fingerprints from the golden brass railings that she is forbidden to lean on, and she empties the trash bins of men who earn more in a single hour than she earns in an entire year of backbreaking labor. No one looks at her. No one greets her. To the executives rushing by with their iced Americanos and leather tablets, she is merely part of the furniture, essential for the building's function, but utterly unworthy of acknowledgement. She has learned to make herself small, to shrink against the cold walls when the important men walk by, to lower her gaze until she is nothing more than a shadow in a faded blue polyester uniform that hangs loosely on her thin frame. And in a way, she prefers it that way. Invisibility is her armor. It protects her from the scorn, the pity, and the cruel reality that she was once a woman of promise, a woman who loved poetry and music, before life's cruel tides washed away her dreams and left her scrubbing the floors of the elite. Her day begins long before the sun rises, in a small, cramped semi-basement apartment on the outskirts of the city, where the smell of damp mold never quite leaves the walls. She wakes up at 4 a.m, her body stiff and protesting against the cold. She boils water on a single burner stove to make a simple soup for her daughter, Min-ji. Min-ji is 24, the same age as the young interns who work at the Gold Group, but unlike them, she cannot walk into a bright future. She spends her days in a hospital bed in the living room, fighting a chronic illness that drains every one Mrs. Han earns. Before leaving, Mrs. Han gently wipes her daughter's sleeping face, whispering a promise that today will be better, that she will work harder, that the debts will be paid. Then she steps out into the biting wind, taking 2 buses and a subway train to reach the tower, arriving before the first executive car pulls up to the valet. This is her life. A cycle of sacrifice, driven by a love so fierce it burns like a coal in her chest. But today, the atmosphere in the Gold Group Tower is shifting. The air feels heavier than usual, charged with a static electricity that makes the hair on one's arms stand up. Outside, the sky has turned a bruised shade of purple and charcoal, signaling the approach of Typhoon Mawar, a storm that the news stations have been warning about for days. Inside, the employees whisper in hushed, terrified tones near the water coolers, their eyes darting nervously toward the private elevators. They check their watches obsessively, adjusting ties that are already perfect, smoothing skirts that have no wrinkles, terrified of being found wanting. The reason for their primal fear is currently ascending the private elevator to the penthouse office on the top floor. Ji-Hoon has returned. Ji-Hoon is the 20-year-old heir to the empire, the grandson of the legendary founder, the boy born with a silver spoon that he sharpened into a knife. He is not like other heirs in the city. He did not spend his youth partying in the clubs of Gangnam or racing sports cars across the winding roads of Europe. He spent it studying corporate law, economics, and ruthless acquisition strategies in the coldest, most elite boarding schools in Switzerland. He was molded, not raised. Rumors swirl around him like poisonous smoke. They say he fired his own nanny when he was 10 for stealing a teaspoon. They say he plans to cut the workforce by 30% before the quarter ends just to see the stock price jump. He is beautiful, with features carved from ice and skin as pale as marble, but his eyes are dark voids, devoid of warmth or empathy. He walks with the precision of a predator, and as he steps into the lobby, a hush falls over the bustling crowd. He is the storm that everyone feared, and he has finally made landfall. His office on the top floor is a fortress of solitude. It is a vast space of black marble and chrome, devoid of personal photos or warm colors. There are no plants, no trinkets, nothing that suggests a human being lives there. Ji-Hoon stands by the window, looking down at the city that looks like a circuit board from this height. He feels nothing for the ants crawling below. His uncle, the vice-chairman Kim Tae-soo, enters the room without knocking. Kim Tae-soo is a man who smiles with his mouth but never with his eyes, a man who reeks of expensive cigars and ambition. "Welcome back, nephew," the uncle says, his voice dripping with false affection. "The board is eager to see what changes you will make. But remember, tradition is the backbone of this company. Do not break what is not broken." Ji-Hoon does not turn around. "Tradition is just an excuse for inefficiency, uncle," he replies, his voice cool and detached. "I reviewed the logistics reports on the plane. We are bleeding money in the staffing department. Why do we have 50 cleaners for a building that is mostly automated? Why do we have a welfare fund for employees who contribute nothing to the bottom line? I will cut the fat. Starting tomorrow." The uncle's smile tightens. He knows that cutting the fat means firing people who are loyal to him, people who help him embezzle funds. But he nods. "As you wish. But be careful. The storm outside is strong, but the currents inside this building are stronger." As the day began to die, surrendering to a twilight that was unusually dark, the wind outside began to howl against the reinforced glass of the skyscraper. It was a mournful wail, a sound that vibrated through the steel bones of the building, rattling the nerves of everyone still inside. By 8 o'clock in the evening, the Gold Group Tower was nearly empty. The department heads, sensing the severity of the coming weather, had sent their teams home early to avoid the deluge. The lights on the lower floors blinked out one by one, leaving the beast of a building to slumber in the darkness. Only 2 hearts still beat within its vast, echoing ribcage, separated by 50 floors of concrete and silence, unaware that their destinies were about to collide with the force of the typhoon itself. On the 50th floor, Mrs. Han was finishing a shift that should have ended hours ago. She had taken a double shift to pay for her daughter's new medication, a secret burden she carried with a silent, stoic dignity that no one in the building knew about. Her back screamed in pain with every movement, but she pushed through it. The hallway was dim, lit only by the emergency track lighting that cast long, distorted shadows on the beige walls. She hummed a soft, melancholic tune, a lullaby from her childhood in the countryside, as she polished the brass handle of the VIP elevator. She knew she wasn't supposed to use this elevator. It was reserved strictly for the board members and the family, a sacred space where the common staff were forbidden to tread, but the service elevator was broken, and she had 4 heavy bags of trash to move to the basement. With a quick, guilty glance around the empty corridor, her heart hammering in her chest, she pressed the button. The golden doors slid open with a smooth, expensive hiss, inviting her into the forbidden luxury. She hesitated, wiping her shoes on the mat so as not to dirty the plush carpet inside. 50 floors above her, in the penthouse office, Ji-Hoon stood staring out at the chaotic city. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling window like bullets, blurring the lights of Seoul into a watercolor painting of gray and black. He hated the rain. It reminded him of the day his parents died in a car crash when he was 6 years old. He remembered the sound of tires screeching on wet pavement, the shattering of glass, and then the cold rain hitting his face as he waited for help that took too long to arrive. That memory was the foundation of his coldness. He had buried it under layers of logic, expensive suits, and endless work. He checked his reflection in the dark glass. Perfect hair. Perfect tie. Perfect mask. He had spent the last 10 hours analyzing spreadsheets, marking names in red ink, people he would fire tomorrow. He told himself he felt nothing. He told himself that emotions were a liability, a weakness that a leader could not afford. But his hand trembled slightly as he reached for his leather briefcase. The isolation of the top floor, usually his sanctuary, now felt suffocating. The silence was too loud. He needed to leave. He needed to outrun the storm outside and the silence in his own head. Ji-Hoon stepped into his private elevator, the interior lined with mirrors and velvet, smelling of leather and sandalwood. He pressed the button for the lobby, closing his eyes, exhaling a breath he felt he had been holding all day. The elevator began its smooth descent, a gilded cage dropping through the throat of the tower. He watched the numbers tick down on the digital display. 55. 54. 53. He loosened his tie slightly, eager to escape the suffocating pressure of his legacy. But then, the elevator stopped. The smooth motion was interrupted by a soft ping. Ji-Hoon's eyes snapped open, annoyed. Who dared to interrupt his descent? This was his private elevator. No one had access. The doors opened on the 50th floor, revealing Mrs. Han. She froze. She was clutching 2 large black trash bags, her face smudged with fatigue, a stray lock of gray hair falling over her forehead. Her eyes went wide with terror as she recognized him, the Prince of Ice, the man who held the fate of thousands in his hands. She looked as if she had seen a ghost. For a moment, neither of them moved. The contrast was stark, the young man in a $5,000 suit, and the older woman in a uniform stained with detergent. I am so sorry, sir, she stammered, bowing her head so low she was almost folded in half, her voice trembling. The service lift, it was broken. I will wait. I will take the stairs. Please forgive me. She tried to back away, her hands shaking so hard the plastic bags rustled loudly in the quiet corridor. Ji-Hoon looked at her. Really looked at her. Usually, people like her were invisible to him, just static in the background of his life. But tonight, with the storm raging and his own memories surfacing, he saw something else. He saw fear. Pure, unadulterated fear. And for a second, he saw not a cleaner, but a human being trembling. The storm outside roared, a crack of thunder shaking the building so violently that the lights in the hallway flickered. He didn't want to be alone in the box. Not tonight. Not with the storm sounding like the crash that killed his parents. Get in, he said, his voice clipped and cold, masking his own unease. Mrs. Han hesitated, terrified to disobey, yet terrified to enter. Sir, I have trash. It smells. I cannot ride with you. I said, get in, he commanded, staring straight ahead, refusing to look at her again. Do not make me repeat myself. She scurried inside, pressing herself into the farthest corner, hugging the trash bags as if they were shields that could protect her from his icy aura. The doors closed, sealing them in a box of uncomfortable silence. The elevator descended again. 49. 48. 47. The numbers ticked down. Mrs. Han held her breath, trying to make herself smaller, praying for the ride to end. Ji-Hoon stared at his own reflection, his jaw clenched, trying to ignore the presence of the woman in the corner and the smell of old coffee grounds coming from the bags. Then, the world turned upside down. A sound like a bomb going off echoed from the elevator shaft, a metallic screech that tore through the air. The cable shuddered violently. The smooth descent turned into a sickening lurch that threw them both off balance. The lights flickered, once, twice, and then died completely. The elevator slammed to a halt between floors, throwing Mrs. Han against the wall and forcing Ji-Hoon to grab the brass rail to stay upright. Total darkness swallowed them. The hum of the ventilation system cut out. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and terrifying. "Sir?" Mrs. Han whispered into the black void, her voice barely audible over the ringing in her own ears. The air in the elevator suddenly felt thin, as if the crash had sucked all the oxygen out of the shaft. She reached out blindly, her fingers brushing against the cold steel wall, trying to orient herself in a world that had lost all definition. "Sir? Are you injured?" No answer came from the other side of the elevator. The silence was thick, heavy, and suffocating. "Sir?" She called again, louder this time, fighting the rising tide of her own panic. She knew that if anything happened to the air, the blame would fall on her. She would be the scapegoat. The thought of her daughter lying in the hospital bed, waiting for medicine that would never come, gave her a sudden surge of courage. She had to take control. Then she heard it. A sound that froze the blood in her veins. It was a ragged, desperate gasping sound, wet and jagged. It wasn't the sound of an arrogant CEO. It wasn't the sound of a powerful man who commanded armies of lawyers. It was the sound of a drowning child fighting for air. In the corner of the elevator, Ji-Hoon had collapsed to the floor. The darkness wasn't just an inconvenience for him, it was a weapon. The moment the lights died, the psychological walls he had built around his mind crumbled. He was no longer 20 years old. He was 6. He was trapped in the twisted metal of his father's sedan, the smell of gasoline burning his nose, the rain pounding on the roof, the darkness pressing against his eyes. The claustrophobia hit him with the violence of a physical blow. His throat constricted. His lungs seized up, refusing to inflate. He clawed at his silk tie, his fingernails scratching his own skin, ripping the expensive fabric away from his neck as if it were a noose. "I can't breathe. I can't see. They are dead. Everyone is dead." The thought spiraled into a vortex of pure terror. Mrs. Han fumbled in the deep pocket of her apron, her fingers trembling uncontrollably as they brushed against her old, cracked smartphone. She pressed the side button, praying the battery hadn't died. A beam of harsh, blue-white light cut through the suffocating darkness, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stale air like ghosts. She moved the light slowly, sweeping the floor until the beam landed on him. The sight broke her heart. Ji-Hoon, the terrifying Heir, the Prince of Ice, was curled into a tight ball in the center of the elevator, his knees pulled desperately to his chest. His face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror, pale as a sheet of paper, beads of cold sweat rolling down his forehead and soaking his collar. His eyes were wide and unseeing, fixed on a point in the darkness that only he could see. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving in short, jagged spasms. He was rocking back and forth, a low keening sound escaping his lips. He looked nothing like the monster the employees whispered about in the break room. He looked broken. He looked like a little boy lost in the dark, waiting for a mother who would never come. In that moment, Mrs. Han forgot about the hierarchy. She forgot about the strict rules that forbade her from looking the CEO in the eye. She forgot that he had the power to fire her, to sue her, to ruin her life with a single snap of his fingers. All she saw was a child in pain. She dropped the heavy trash bags, not caring if they spilled, and knelt beside him. The marble floor was cold and hard against her aching rheumatic knees, but she didn't feel it. She reached out, her rough, warm hand covering his trembling, icy one. The contact was electric. Ji-Hoon flinched violently, as if he had been burned. "Look at me," she said. Her voice had changed completely. The submissive, fearful tremble was gone, replaced by a tone of steel and velvet, the ancient, commanding voice of a mother who had nursed children through high fevers, broken bones, and night terrors. "Young man, look at me right now." Ji-Hoon couldn't speak. He thrashed weakly, trying to push her away, choking on his own panic. "Can't breathe, dying, here," he gasped, the words tearing out of his throat in shreds. You are not dying, Mrs. Han said firmly, gripping his hand tighter, anchoring him to the earth with her callous strength. It is just a memory. The air is here. I am breathing it. You can breathe it too. She moved the phone light so it wasn't blinding him, casting a soft, golden glow on her weathered face, highlighting the kindness in her eyes. Match my breathing. Listen to my voice. In and out. Slowly. In and out. He shook his head, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the sweat. Do not shake your head. Listen to me. Mrs. Han moved closer, invading the personal space that no employee was ever allowed to breach. She began to hum. It was the same song she had been humming in the hallway, a simple, mournful folk melody about a small boat weathering a great storm, a song her grandmother had sung to her during the war. The sound was incongruous in the high-tech trap, a relic of a simpler, poorer world echoing against the brushed steel walls. But it cut through the noise in Ji-Hoon's head like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. He focused on the vibration of her voice. He focused on the rough texture of her hand, so different from the soft, manicured hands of the people in his world. Her hand felt like work. It felt like survival. For the first time in 20 years, someone was seeing him not as an asset, not as a boss, not as a target for manipulation, but as a frightened human being in the dark. And for the first time, the boy inside the suit let someone in. Slowly, painfully, his breathing began to match hers. The jagged gasps smoothed out into deep, shuddering breaths. His rocking slowed. He gripped her hand back, squeezing it so hard her knuckles turned white, holding on to her as if she were the only solid thing in a dissolving universe. 20 minutes later, the emergency lights flickered back to life, bathing the elevator in a sickly, pulsating red glow. The hum of the ventilation system returned with a mechanical groan, signaling that the power grid was stabilizing. The magic of the moment shattered instantly. Ji-Hoon sat slumped against the mirrored wall, his expensive Italian suit rumpled, his tie lying on the floor like a dead snake. The panic attack had passed, leaving him exhausted, humiliated, and strangely hollow. Opposite him sat Mrs. Han, her hands folded neatly in her lap, looking as if she were waiting for a bus rather than trapped with the most powerful man in the building. She had turned off her flashlight, giving him the dignity of the shadows. Ji-Hoon cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the small space. He stood up, his legs shaky, and began adjusting his cufflinks with trembling fingers, desperate to rebuild the walls of his fortress. He smoothed his hair, fixed his collar, and donned his mask of indifference again. You saw nothing, he said, his voice regaining its sharp, commanding edge, though it lacked its usual bite. He refused to look at her. Do you understand? If a word of this leaves this elevator, if you tell anyone the CEO was on the floor crying like a child, you will be fired before you can blink. You will be blacklisted. You will never work in this city again. Mrs. Han looked up at him. Most people would have flinched at the threat. Most people would have begged for mercy, terrified by his wrath. But she just smiled, a sad, knowing smile that unnerved him more than any argument could. She saw through the suit. She saw the scared boy hiding behind the threats. Sir, she said softly, standing up to face him, though she was a head shorter than him. She reached into the pocket of her faded blue uniform and pulled out a small, plastic-wrapped object. It was a triangle kimbap, cheap convenience store rice wrapped in seaweed, costing less than $1. It was her dinner. You are shaking because your blood sugar is low. Panic burns energy. Eat this. It is tuna mayo. It is not gourmet, but it helps. Ji-Hoon stared at the cheap plastic wrapper. He wanted to slap it away. He wanted to scream at her for her insolence, for daring to offer him peasant food, for acting like she knew him. But his stomach growled, a traitorous sound in the quiet space. His hand moved on its own, taking the food. He stared at it for a long second, then tore it open and took a bite. It was cold, salty, and utterly ordinary. And yet, as he swallowed, he felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with calories. It tasted like care. It tasted like the mother he had lost. When the maintenance crew finally pried the doors open on the lobby floor, Ji-Hoon marched out without looking back, barking orders at his security team to seal the area and ignoring the questions of his staff. He strode toward his waiting limousine, a figure of absolute power once again. Mrs. Han quietly picked up her trash bags and disappeared into the shadows of the service corridor, becoming invisible once again. But the invisible thread between them had been spun, and it was stronger than steel. Neither of them knew it yet, but the hierarchy of the gold group had just begun to crack. The morning sun rose over Seoul, casting long, pale shadows across the glass face of the gold group tower. Inside, the machine of commerce began to turn once again. Thousands of employees flooded through the revolving doors, swiping their badges, drinking their coffees, and preparing for another day of survival in the corporate jungle. But on the top floor, the atmosphere had shifted in a way that no one could quite articulate. Ji-Hoon sat at his massive glass desk, staring at a financial report that had been placed there by his secretary at 6 in the morning. The numbers usually sang to him. He could look at a spreadsheet and see the story of a company, its weaknesses, its leaks, its potential. But today, the numbers were just black ink on white paper. They meant nothing. His mind kept drifting back to the sensation of a rough hand holding his, the sound of a humming voice in the dark, and the taste of cold tuna mayo. He felt unmoored. For the first time in his life, the cold armor of his identity felt heavy and suffocating. He touched his neck, where his tie usually sat tight against his throat. Today, he had left the top button undone. A small rebellion. A crack in the ice. He needed to clear his head. He needed to verify that the night before had been a hallucination, a momentary lapse of sanity caused by low blood sugar and stress. He stood up, ignoring the blinking light on his office phone, and walked out. "Where are you going, sir?" his secretary asked, jumping to her feet in alarm. "You have a meeting with the head of human resources in 10 minutes regarding the layoffs." "Cancel it," Ji-Hoon said, not breaking his stride. "Move it to tomorrow." He didn't go to the boardroom. He didn't go to the executive lounge. He took the service elevator, the one that had been repaired overnight, and pressed the button for the roof. The roof of the Gold Group Tower was a desolate, windswept place, a stark contrast to the polished luxury of the floors below. It was a maze of massive gray ventilation ducts, humming air conditioning units, and rusted pipes. It smelled of ozone, city dust, and exhaust fumes rising from the street 50 floors down. It was a place where the building breathed, dirty and loud. It was also the only place where the invisible people, the cleaners, the security guards, the maintenance staff, could find a moment of peace. Ji-Hoon stepped out into the wind, his hair instantly whipped across his forehead. He scanned the gray expanse, feeling foolish. What was he doing here? He was the CEO. He belonged in the climate-controlled office, not here among the smokestacks. He turned to leave, telling himself to get a grip on reality. Then he saw her. Mrs. Han was sitting on a small, weathered wooden bench tucked behind a massive cooling tower, sheltered from the worst of the wind. She was alone. On her lap sat a stack of mismatched Tupperware containers, worn from years of use. She was eating rice and kimchi with quiet, deliberate movements, staring out at the hazy skyline of the city that had forgotten her. She looked small against the backdrop of the metropolis, fragile yet undeniably enduring. Ji-Hoon walked toward her. His expensive leather shoes clicked on the concrete, a foreign sound in this industrial space. Mrs. Han paused, her chopsticks halfway to her mouth. She didn't jump up. She didn't bow. She simply turned her head and looked at him. Her eyes were not fearful today. They were calm. She looked at him as if she had been expecting him. "You are not wearing your coat," she said simply. "The wind is sharp up here. You will catch a cold." Ji-Hoon stopped a few feet away, his hands shoved deep into his pockets to hide a sudden tremor. "I don't get cold," he replied, his voice stiff. "Everyone gets cold," she countered, placing a piece of pickled radish on her rice. "Even princes." "Why are you here? Did you come to fire me personally?" Ji-Hoon blinked. The thought hadn't even crossed his mind. No, he said. I came to check the structural integrity of the roof. Mrs. Han let out a small, dry laugh. It sounded like leaves rustling on a pavement. You are a terrible liar, young man. You came because the air downstairs is too thin for you today. Sit. She shifted her Tupperware, making a small space on the dirty bench. It was an invitation that violated every protocol of the company. A CEO did not sit on a bench with a cleaner. It was absurd. It was improper. Ji-Hoon sat down. The silence between them was filled with the low hum of the city. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Ji-Hoon watched her eat. It was a humble meal, likely leftovers from the night before, but she ate it with a sense of gratitude that he found baffling. He had eaten at Michelin-star restaurants in Paris and Tokyo, yet he had never seen anyone enjoy food quite like this. Why do you want to fire the logistics team? She asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Ji-Hoon stiffened. How do you know about that? That is confidential information. There are no secrets in a building this big, she replied, taking a sip of water from a plastic thermos. The trash bins tell stories. I empty the bins on the 12th floor. I see the drafts of the termination letters. I see the stress in the eyes of the men who work there. Why? They are inefficient, Ji-Hoon recited the lines he had memorized from the reports. Their redundant costs are dragging down our quarterly projection by 0.4%. They are consistently overtime, yet their output is stagnant. I have run the numbers. They are dead weight. A tumor that needs to be cut. Mrs. Han shook her head slowly, clicking her tongue against the roof of her mouth. You look at numbers, she said softly. I look at people. Do you know why they are overtime? Do you know why they stay until 10 at night, missing dinner with their children? Inefficiency, Ji-Hoon repeated. No, she said firmly, turning to face him. Because your inventory software, the one your uncle purchased 3 years ago to save money, crashes every day at 4 p.m. I hear them. I hear them cursing at the screens. I hear them calling tech support and getting no answer. They have to input the data manually, line by line, to ensure the shipments go out. They are not lazy, Ji-Hoon. They are cleaning up a mess that management created. If you fire them, the manual knowledge goes with them. The system will collapse within a week. Ji-Hoon opened his mouth to argue, to crush her with his superior intellect and his Swiss education. But the words died in his throat. He thought about the red lines on his spreadsheet. He thought about the software maintenance costs that were strangely low. Fix the software, Mrs. Han said, returning to her meal. Keep the men. Loyalty is cheaper than training new staff. And buy them new chairs. Their backs hurt. I find pain patches in their trash every day. Ji-Hoon stared at her. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, the cracking of a paradigm. He stood up abruptly. I have to go, he said, his voice tight. Mrs. Han didn't look up. Eat a proper lunch, she called after him. No more triangle kimbap. Ji-Hoon walked back to the elevator, his mind racing. When he reached his office, he didn't call HR. Instead, he called the IT department. Pull the logs for the inventory system for the last 6 months, he ordered. And get me the specifications for the chairs on the 12th floor. By the end of the day, the truth was staring him in the face. The logs showed daily crashes at 4 p.m., exactly as she had said. The software was obsolete garbage. The men he was about to fire were heroes who had been holding the department together with duct tape and sheer will. Ji-Hoon sat back in his leather chair, the city lights flickering on outside his window. He felt a chill run down his spine. A 50-year-old cleaner with a high school education knew more about the operational reality of his company than his entire board of directors. The next day at noon, Ji-Hoon went back to the roof. This time, he brought 2 sandwiches from the executive deli. Roast beef on ciabatta. He placed one on the bench next to Mrs. Han. The software is being replaced, he said, staring straight ahead. And the layoffs are cancelled. Mrs. Han looked at the sandwich, then at him. A small smile touched her lips. Good, she said. Now, let's talk about the marketing department. They are wasting too much paper. And so, the alliance was born. Every day, high above the city, the prince and the pauper met. It became their war room. Ji-Hoon would bring complex problems involving millions of dollars, mergers, and acquisitions. Mrs. Han would peel an apple or share her kimchi, and she would dismantle his complex problems with brutal, grounding common sense. She taught him to see the human cost of his decisions. She taught him that a company was not a machine, but a living organism made of people with families, debts, and dreams. Under her guidance, Ji-Hoon began to change. The Prince of Ice began to thaw. He started greeting employees in the elevator. He stopped measuring success solely by stock price and started looking at retention rates. The atmosphere in the gold group began to shift. Laughter returned to the cafeteria. Fear was replaced by a cautious optimism. But happiness is a fragile thing in a tower built on ambition. The rooftop meetings had not gone unnoticed. Far below, in an office filled with smoke and shadows, the uncle, Kim Tae-soo, was watching. He held a stack of photographs in his hand, grainy, long-distance shots taken by a private investigator. They showed the CEO sitting on a bench next to a woman in a cleaning uniform. A cleaner? The uncle laughed softly, the sound like dry bones breaking. He tossed the photos onto his desk. You are getting advice from a janitor, my dear nephew? Oh, this is too perfect. I won't just destroy you. I will humiliate you so deeply that you will never show your face in Seoul again. And as for her. He picked up the phone and dialed the head of security. I have a job for you, he said, his eyes gleaming with malice. It involves a locker on the basement level. Make it messy. The storm outside had passed, but inside the tower, a hurricane was about to break. And Mrs. Han, the woman who only wanted to pay her debts and protect the boy who reminded her of a lost son, was standing directly in its path, completely unaware that the axe was about to fall. The trap was sprung on a Tuesday morning, a day chosen with malicious precision by the uncle, Kim Tae-soo. He knew that Tuesday was the day Ji-Hoon was scheduled to fly to Tokyo for a critical negotiation with Japanese investors regarding the expansion of the Gold Group's semiconductor division. Without the young CEO's physical presence in the building, the tower belonged to the uncle. Without the predator guarding the gate, the wolves were free to hunt. Ji-Hoon had felt a strange unease before leaving. Standing in the lobby at dawn, waiting for his driver, he had scanned the floor for a glimpse of a blue uniform, but Mrs. Han was already in the basement, starting her shift. He texted her a brief message on his secure line, "Do not go to the roof today. It is raining. Eat inside." It was the closest he could come to saying, "Stay safe." He didn't wait for a reply before the black sedan whisked him away to Incheon Airport, leaving the fortress unguarded. By 10 a.m., a whisper began to circulate through the 50 floors of the tower. It started in the executive wing and trickled down like poison into the water supply. Theft. A prototype of the company's unreleased smartwatch, the Gold Watch X, a device worth millions in research and development, had vanished from the secure vault on the 50th floor. The rumor evolved as it traveled. First, it was just missing. Then, it was stolen by a corporate spy. Finally, the narrative settled on the version the uncle had crafted, an inside job by low-level staff. Security teams, dressed in tactical black uniforms that made them look more like soldiers than guards, swarmed the building. They locked down the exits. They set up checkpoints at the elevators. But it was all theater. A terrifying pantomime designed to justify what was about to happen. They knew exactly where they were going. Mrs. Han was in the basement break room, a windowless concrete box that smelled of stale coffee and wet mops. She was washing her hands after her morning shift, humming that same folk song, thinking about the extra money she would make this month thanks to Ji-Hoon's new overtime policy. The door burst open with a violence that made the rusted hinges scream. The head of security, Mr. Kong, a man with a neck as thick as a tree trunk and eyes devoid of mercy, marched in. Behind him stood the vice chairman, Kim Tae-soo, wearing a suit that cost more than Mrs. Han's entire life earnings. He was smiling. Music stops. Mr. Kang barked, startling the few cleaners who were eating their lunch. Everyone against the wall. Now. Mrs. Han wiped her hands on her apron, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the vice chairman, and in his eyes, she saw her doom. She saw the same look a cat gives a mouse before breaking its neck. "Open it," the uncle commanded, pointing a manicured finger at Mrs. Han's rusted locker, number 402. "Sir, I have nothing but my clothes and my daughter's medicine," Mrs. Han stammered, her voice trembling not with guilt, but with the instinctive fear of the poor facing the powerful. "Why are you doing this? Open the locker, or we will open it for you." Mr. Kang stepped forward, his hand resting on his baton. Her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the key, Mrs. Han unlocked the small metal door. Before she could even step back, Mr. Kang reached in, grabbed her worn-out canvas tote bag, and dumped its contents onto the dirty linoleum floor. The sound was deafening in the silence. Out tumbled her spare uniform, a worn Bible with a cracked spine, a half-eaten apple, and a sleek, silver box stamped with the gold logo of the company. A collective gasp went through the room. The other cleaners, women she had worked with for 10 years, women she had shared meals and tears with, stepped back. They looked at her with horror, afraid that the contagion of her guilt would infect them too. Mrs. Han stared at the box. Her mind couldn't comprehend it. It was like a magic trick. One moment it wasn't there, and now it was destroying her life. I have never seen this," she whispered, falling to her knees. "I swear on my life. I swear on my daughter's life. Someone put this here. Please, believe me." The uncle stepped forward, his polished shoe stopping inches from her hand. "Save your tears for the police," he sneered, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "You thought because you brought coffee to my nephew, you were untouchable? You thought you could climb out of the gutter? You are a parasite. And today, we fumigate the building." He turned to Mr. Kang. "Escort her out. Through the main lobby. I want every employee to see what happens to thieves. Make an example of her." "No, please. Not the lobby." Mrs. Han begged, grabbing the hem of his trousers. "Just let me go out the back. Please, I have dignity." "Dignity is for people who don't steal," the uncle said, kicking her hand away. "Take her." What followed was a procession of shame that would be etched into the memory of the Gold Group forever. 2 large security guards grabbed Mrs. Han by her arms, lifting her off her feet as if she weighed nothing. They marched her out of the basement, into the elevator, and up to the ground floor. It was lunch rush. The massive marble lobby was packed with hundreds of employees, the same people whose jobs Mrs. Han had helped save, the same people whose chairs she had replaced, whose food she had improved. They stopped. They stared. The hum of conversation died instantly. Mrs. Han tried to hide her face, but there was nowhere to hide. She was paraded through the center of the atrium. She saw the logistics manager, the man she had defended on the roof, look away in embarrassment. She saw the young interns whispering and pointing. She felt their eyes like physical blows. Thief. Traitor. Ungrateful. The words hung in the air, unspoken but deafening. She didn't struggle. She didn't scream. She realized, with a crushing finality, that truth didn't matter here. Power mattered. Narrative mattered. And she had neither. She walked with her head bowed, tears streaming silently down her face, clutching her Bible to her chest as her only shield. They shoved her through the revolving doors and onto the cold pavement. "Don't come back," Mr. Kang spat, throwing her canvas bag after her. "If we see you within 50 meters of this building, you will be arrested." Mrs. Han stood on the sidewalk, the wind whipping her hair across her face. The towering glass building behind her, the place she had cleaned for a decade, now reflected her distorted image. She was alone. She had lost her job. She would lose her apartment. Her daughter would lose her treatment. The weight of the injustice broke her legs. She collapsed right there on the concrete, under the shadow of the Golden Tower, and wept until her throat was raw. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in a high-rise conference room in Tokyo, Ji-Hoon was in the middle of closing the deal of his career. The Japanese investors were impressed. The contract was on the table. He reached for his pen to sign. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A single vibration. Normally, he would ignore it. But a cold feeling, a premonition inherited from the trauma of his childhood, made him stop. He apologized to the investors and pulled the phone out. It was a text from his uncle. There were no words. Just a photo. It was a picture taken from the lobby security camera. It showed Mrs. Han, flanked by guards, looking small and broken, being dragged toward the door. Below it, a single news link: Gold Group cleaner caught stealing millions in corporate espionage scandal. The pen snapped in Ji-Hoon's hand. Ink bled onto his fingers, black as oil. The room went silent. The Japanese CEO looked at him with concern. "Mr. Park? Is everything all right?" Ji-Hoon stared at the screen. The old Ji-Hoon, the cold, calculating heir trained in Switzerland, would have deleted the message. He would have signed the deal, secured his position, and dealt with the personnel issue later. He would have calculated the risk. Defending a thief would make him look weak. It would give the board ammunition to fire him. But the man sitting in that chair was no longer just an heir. He was the man who had sat on a rooftop eating kimchi. He was the man who had been held in the dark when he couldn't breathe. He remembered what Mrs. Han had told him: family is who wipes your tears. He stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Mr. Park?" the investor asked, confused. "The contract?" Ji-Hoon looked at them, his eyes burning with a terrifying, cold intensity that made the seasoned businessmen flinch. "The meeting is over," Ji-Hoon said, his voice low and dangerous. "But, the deal?" "There is no deal if I don't have a company to come back to," Ji-Hoon replied. He buttoned his jacket, checking the time. He had to get to the airport. He had a war to win. "Gentlemen," he said, turning to the door. "Pray for my enemies. Because I am going home." The flight back to Seoul was a blur of turbulence and dark thoughts. Ji-Hoon sat in the first-class cabin, staring at the untouched glass of champagne on his tray table. The plane cut through the clouds like a dagger, descending into a city that felt hostile for the first time in his life. His phone had not stopped vibrating for hours. 53 missed calls from the board of directors. 12 frantic voicemails from his secretary. And one smug, silent email from his uncle containing the agenda for an emergency board meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning: motion to dismiss CEO Park Ji-Hoon. When the wheels touched the tarmac at Incheon International Airport, it was midnight. The rain had returned, washing the neon streets of Seoul in a slick, dangerous sheen. Ji-Hoon didn't take his usual limousine. He knew his driver reported to the head of security, and the head of security belonged to his uncle. Instead, he pulled a black cap low over his eyes, hailed a regular taxi, and gave an address that no CEO in the history of the Gold Group had ever visited. He didn't go to his penthouse. He went to the semi-basement apartment district in the old quarter of the city. He found Mrs. Han's building by the smell of damp concrete and the sound of distant traffic. It was a crumbling brick structure that seemed to lean wearily against its neighbors. He stood in front of the rusted metal door of apartment B01, his hand raised to knock, but he hesitated. What could he say? "I'm sorry I let them destroy you." The weight of his failure pressed down on his chest, heavier than the humidity. He knocked. 3 soft raps. There was no answer for a long time. Then, the sound of a heavy lock sliding back. The door creaked open a few inches, held by a safety chain. Mrs. Han's face appeared in the gap. She looked 10 years older than she had that morning. Her eyes were red and swollen, stripped of the light that usually lived there. She was wearing old sweatpants and a t-shirt, packing boxes visible behind her. Ji-Hoon? She whispered, her voice cracking. You should not be here. If they see you. Let them see me, Ji-Hoon said, his voice raw. Open the door, Mrs. Han. Please. She undid the chain and let him in. The apartment was tiny, barely larger than his bathroom. It smelled of boiled medicine and old paper. In the corner, a single hospital bed was set up, where a pale young woman, her daughter, slept fitfully, hooked up to a breathing machine. The sight hit Ji-Hoon like a physical blow. This was what she was fighting for. This was why she endured the trash, the insults, the invisibility. I am packing, Mrs. Han said, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. The landlord heard the news. He doesn't want a thief in the building. We have to leave by tomorrow. I don't know where we will go. You are not going anywhere, Ji-Hoon said, stepping forward. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled picture his uncle had sent him. You are not a thief. And I am going to prove it. But I cannot do it alone. I need my advisor. Mrs. Han looked at him, shaking her head. It's over, Ji-Hoon. They have the evidence. The watch was in my locker. The watch was planted, Ji-Hoon said, his eyes hardening. And I know exactly who did it. But I need to get into the building to prove it. My access codes have been revoked. Security is watching the entrances. I need a way in. Mrs. Han looked at her sleeping daughter, then back at the young man who stood in her kitchen looking like a fallen prince. She took a deep breath, straightening her spine. The despair in her eyes was replaced by a flicker of the old steel. The freight elevator, she said softly. The sensor on the loading dock door has been broken for 3 months. Security thinks it's locked, but if you lift the handle up and to the left, it opens. I reported it 5 times. They never fixed it. Ji-Hoon managed a small, grim smile. Their incompetence is our weapon. An hour later, under the cover of the storm, a black taxi dropped them a block away from the Gold Group Tower. They didn't walk to the front door. They crept through the alleyway where the garbage trucks parked. Mrs. Han moved with surprising stealth, guiding Ji-Hoon past the security cameras she knew by heart. Duck here. Wait. Run now. She navigated the shadows of the building she had cleaned for a decade, turning her invisibility into a superpower. They reached the loading dock. Just as she said, the rusted metal door groaned but opened when Ji-Hoon lifted the handle. They slipped inside the humid, smelling darkness of the basement. But they weren't alone. As they turned the corner toward the server room, 3 figures stepped out of the shadows. Ji-Hoon tensed, stepping in front of Mrs. Han to protect her. But Mrs. Han put a hand on his arm. It's okay, she whispered. It was the logistics team. The 3 men Ji-Hoon had almost fired, the ones whose jobs Mrs. Han had saved. They were wearing hoodies, their faces grim but determined. Mr. Lee, the team leader, stepped forward. He looked at Mrs. Han, then at the CEO. We heard what happened, he said, his voice low. We saw them drag you out, Auntie. It wasn't right. We know the uncle's secretary came down here at 5 a.m. yesterday, another man added, holding up a tablet. We checked the manual logs. But the digital footage was deleted from the main server. Can you get it back? Ji-Hoon asked, looking at the men he had once called dead weight. Mr. Lee cracked his knuckles. Sir, we built this network. We know where the backups hide. For the next 3 hours, the basement of the Gold Group Tower became a command center. While the uncle slept in his mansion, dreaming of his victory, the invisible people of his company were dismantling his coup. Mrs. Han made instant coffee for the men. Ji-Hoon stood shoulder to shoulder with the IT guys, watching lines of code scroll across the screen. Got it, Mr. Lee whispered at 3:45 a.m. On the grainy screen, a time-stamped video appeared. It showed the uncle's personal secretary, a man named Mr. Kim, creeping into the locker room. He looked around nervously, pulled a silver box from his jacket, and shoved it into locker 402. Ji-Hoon stared at the screen, a cold fury burning in his chest. "Copy it," he ordered. "Copy it to 5 different drives. And get the audio file from the executive suite bug." "We have that too," Mr. Lee smiled grimly. "The golf bag bug is transmitting loud and clear. We have him confessing to the entire plot while drinking whiskey with the head of security." Ji-Hoon took the USB drive. It felt light in his hand, but he knew it held the weight of a nuclear bomb. He turned to Mrs. Han. She was sitting on a crate, looking exhausted but relieved. "We have the bullet," Ji-Hoon said. "Now we need to deliver the shot." He looked at her faded, stained clothes. "But you cannot walk into that boardroom like this. If we are going to take back the kingdom, we need to dress for the coronation." At 7 a.m., just as the sun began to rise, chasing away the storm clouds, a luxury boutique in the Gangnam district opened its doors early for a very exclusive client. The shop assistants were confused to see the famous Heir of Gold group accompanied by a small, weary woman in a cleaning uniform. But Ji-Hoon's credit card, the black edition, silenced any questions. Ji-Hoon walked through the racks of silk and wool, selecting items with precision. He didn't choose flashy colors. He chose power. Navy blue. Sharp tailoring. High collars. "Try this," he said, handing Mrs. Han a dress suit that cost more than her car. When Mrs. Han stepped out of the dressing room, the shop assistants gasped. The uniform had hidden her posture, her grace. In the tailored suit, with her gray hair pulled back into an elegant bun, she didn't look like a cleaner. She looked like a matriarch. She looked like she owned the building she used to scrub. Mrs. Han looked at herself in the mirror, touching the fine fabric with her rough hands. Tears welled in her eyes. I look like someone else." "No," Ji-Hoon said, standing behind her, adjusting her collar. "You look like yourself. You look like the woman who saved my life in the elevator. You look like the director of the Gold Group." He checked his watch. It was 8:55 a.m. The board meeting started in 5 minutes. "Ready?" he asked, offering her his arm. Mrs. Han took a deep breath, channeling every ounce of strength she had gathered over 50 years of hardship. She took his arm. "Ready." They walked out of the store and into the waiting car. The ride to the tower was silent. As they approached the building, they saw the media vans parked outside. The uncle had leaked the story of the firing to the press to ensure Ji-Hoon's public humiliation. Cameras flashed as the car pulled up. But they didn't stop for questions. They walked through the lobby. The same lobby where Mrs. Han had been dragged through the mud yesterday. This time, the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of judgment. It was the silence of awe. Security guards stepped aside, confused by the transformation. The receptionist dropped her phone. Ji-Hoon and Mrs. Han didn't look left or right. They walked straight to the VIP elevator, the same elevator where it all began. Ji-Hoon pressed the button for the top floor. As the doors closed, sealing them in together, Mrs. Han squeezed his hand one last time. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Ji-Hoon replied, his eyes fixed on the digital numbers ticking up. 48, 49. 50, the doors opened. "Let's go fire my uncle." The emergency board meeting was already underway when they arrived outside the double mahogany doors. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive coffee and betrayal. The uncle, Kim Tae-soo, sat at the head of the massive table, practically vibrating with triumph. Sunlight streamed in through the blinds, slicing the room into bars of light and shadow, illuminating the nervous faces of the 12 directors. They shifted in their leather chairs, avoiding eye contact, knowing they were about to slaughter a bloodline. "Ji-Hoon is young," the uncle declared, his voice smooth and practiced, echoing in the silent room. "He is emotional. He allowed a thief to infiltrate our highest levels because he has unmet psychological needs. We need a strong hand. We need leadership that doesn't befriend the help. We need to secure the future of the Gold Group, and that future does not include a boy who plays house with janitors. The directors nodded, murmuring their agreement like a chorus of obedient shadows. The pen was poised over the paper. The vote of no confidence was about to be cast. Then, a sound like a gunshot shattered the tension. The heavy double doors of the boardroom didn't just open, they were thrown wide with enough force to crack the plaster around the frame. Ji-Hoon strode in. The energy in the room shifted instantly. He wasn't the tentative boy who had left for Tokyo, he was a storm front. And he wasn't alone. Walking beside him, wearing the navy blue dress suit that fit her like armor, was Mrs. Han. Her head was high, her posture regal. She didn't look at the floor. She looked directly at the men who had ignored her for 10 years. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy enough to crush a man. You brought the thief here? The uncle stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor, his face turning a deep, mottled purple. Security. Remove them. Get this trash out of my boardroom. Sit down, uncle. Ji-Hoon's voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of an executioner's blade. It was a command, not a request. If anyone calls security, it will be to arrest you. He walked to the center of the room and threw the small black USB drive onto the polished mahogany table. It slid across the wood with a hiss, stopping perfectly in the center, spinning slightly. Every eye in the room was fixed on the tiny plastic object. You accused Mrs. Han of stealing a prototype on Tuesday, Ji-Hoon said, pacing around the table like a tiger circling trapped prey. You ruined her reputation. You fired her. You claimed you had evidence. Well, so do I. He picked up the remote control for the room's audiovisual system and pressed a button. The wall screen flickered to life. It wasn't the stolen watch footage. It was the footage from the basement server room, the footage the logistics team had recovered from the depths of the deleted archives. The screen showed the uncle's personal secretary, grainy but unmistakable, looking over his shoulder before shoving the silver box into Mrs. Han's locker. Gasps rippled through the room. The uncle froze, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. That is doctored. Deep fake. He sputtered, sweat beading on his forehead. And this? Ji-Hoon asked, pressing another button. This time, it was audio. Crystal clear digital audio recorded from the bug in the golf bag. The uncle's voice filled the room, magnified by the surround sound speakers, unmistakable in its arrogance. Plant the watch in her locker on Tuesday. Make sure it's public. Break her spirit. Once the cleaner is gone, the boy will crumble. He is weak without her. And then, the Chinese deal goes through on Friday. The recording ended with the sound of a cigar being lit and a cruel, dismissive laugh. The room erupted. The directors turned on the uncle like a pack of wolves sensing a wounded member. The corruption wasn't just petty theft, it was corporate treason. He was selling them out to a foreign rival. The uncle slumped in his chair, the color draining from his face, realizing he had been outplayed not by a business rival, not by a lawyer, but by the intuition of the woman he had called a parasite. Ji-Hoon stopped pacing and stood beside Mrs. Han. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a public gesture of respect and intimacy that shattered every unwritten rule of the Gold Group hierarchy. You called her a cleaner, Ji-Hoon addressed the room, his voice shaking with suppressed emotion. I call her the only person in this building with a moral compass. While you were plotting to sell this company for parts, she was telling me how to save it. She is not a thief. She is the reason you all still have jobs. He turned to Mrs. Han, his expression softening, the ice finally melting completely. Mrs. Han, I accept your resignation as a cleaner. Effective immediately, I am appointing you as the Director of Staff Welfare and Internal Ethics. No decision regarding the employees will be made without your signature. You will have an office on the 50th floor. And no one will ever look through you again. Mrs. Han looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, not of shame this time, but of overwhelming vindication. She didn't bow. She didn't shrink. She simply reached out and squeezed his hand, the the same way she had in the dark elevator when the world was ending. "Thank you, Ji-Hoon," she whispered. "Not sir. Not CEO. Just Ji-Hoon." The uncle was escorted out by the same security guards he had ordered to attack Mrs. Han, dragging his feet, screaming threats that no one listened to. As the doors closed on his shouting figure, the board members stood up, one by one. Driven by fear, respect, or perhaps a sudden awakening of their own conscience, they bowed to the new director. The hierarchy of the Gold Group hadn't just changed, it had evolved. The Prince of Ice had finally found his heart, and the woman who cleaned the floors was now the soul of the tower. 6 months later. The Gold Group tower still pierces the clouds above Seoul, but the atmosphere inside has changed. The air is no longer frigid. The silence is no longer heavy. In the basement, the locker room has been renovated. The rusted metal is gone, replaced by bright wood and warm lights. The logistics team now works on a new software system that doesn't crash, sitting in ergonomic chairs that don't hurt their backs. Mrs. Han sits in her office on the 50th floor. It overlooks the city, but she keeps the blinds open. On her desk, there is a framed photo of her daughter, Min-ji, who is no longer in a hospital bed. Thanks to the company's new medical insurance policy, Min-ji is in recovery, learning to paint in the park on Sundays. Next to the photo sits a small, plastic-wrapped triangle kimbap, a reminder of where she came from. The door opens, and Ji-Hoon walks in. He looks different. The sharp lines of stress around his eyes have softened. He smiles easily now. "Ready for lunch?" he asks. Mrs. Han stands up, smoothing her suit. "Only if we go to the roof," she replies with a twinkle in her eye. "The air is better up there." Together, the CEO and the former cleaner walk to the elevator. They step inside, and as the doors close, neither of them is afraid of the dark anymore. They know that no matter what storms may come, they will weather them together. In the end, the story of the cleaner and the air became a legend in the city. It was a reminder to every soul and soul that gold is just metal, and status is just a game. True value lies in the hands that work, the hearts that care, and the courage to see the humanity in the invisible. Thank you for watching this incredible journey of redemption. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that kindness is the ultimate strength, please leave a like and share this video with someone you value. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story that moves the soul. Until next time, remember, everyone has a story worth hearing.